All right. So learning styles, right? Everyone wants to know, like, are they real? Are they BS? And, like, what can we actually do with that knowledge? So we did a deep dive for you. And we found this massive research review. It looked at 71 different learning styles models.
71.
Yeah, it's wild, right?
That's amazing.
So much to unpack.
It is, isn't it? Like, this is a whole world, like this need to categorize ourselves,
Yeah.
right? To figure out, okay, what's the best way I learn?
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is, like, some of the research is saying that maybe it's a lot more fluid than we think.
Okay, so no more quiz to tell me if I'm, like, a visual learner.
Right.
So what did this review actually find then?
Well, it's interesting. It's pretty critical of a lot of the popular models that are out there. A lot of them just don't have very strong scientific backing.
Yeah.
So, for instance, you've probably heard of Dun and Dun.
Oh, yeah.
They talk about how, like, the environment impacts learning, like whether it's lighting or even like snacks.
Oh, yeah, dim the lights, grab a snack and learn.
Exactly.
But are you saying that research doesn't really support that?
Well, one of the criticisms is that a lot of their studies rely on self-reported data, which, can be a little bit unreliable.
Yeah.
Because people don't always perceive how their environment is actually impacting them, right?
Right.
And so when other researchers have tried to replicate those findings in, like, more controlled settings, they haven't really gotten consistent results.
So maybe I don't need to stock up on popcorn for my next study session then?
Probably not.
Okay.
But this issue of, like, shaky evidence isn't just limited to Dun and Dun.
Right.
It kind of comes up with a lot of the other popular models, too.
Like Gregor Gruck.
Yeah.
The one that's like concrete, sequential, abstract, random.
Yes.
That one always seemed a little more complex to me than the others.
It is a bit more complex, but the problem is that even if those categories were accurate, the test itself is flawed. It hasn't consistently shown that it's reliable.
Yeah.
So you could take the test like twice and get different results. So then it's like, well, what are we even measuring here?
Yeah, are we really measuring a learning style?
Right. So it's like, okay, if even the test is kind of questionable, what's the point of even figuring out if I'm a concrete sequential learner?
Right,
whatever.
right.
It seems like there's a pattern here.
Yeah.
Of, like, interesting ideas, but the science just isn't really that solid.
Yeah, what about Kolb's learning cycle?
Oh, yeah.
I remember studying that, like feeling, thinking, doing reflecting.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, the idea of experiential learning is certainly valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Kolb's model highlights how we can learn through, all those different modes of experience.
Right.
But the problem is that the research on, like, matching teaching styles to specific Kolb learning styles.
Yeah.
It's just not there. There's no convincing evidence that it actually improves learning.
Interesting.
Like, if you teach to somebody's Kolb style, it doesn't actually seem to make a difference.
So we've got all these, like, big names in learning styles, all this criticism. Is there anything in this whole field that, like, stood up to scrutiny?
Yeah, actually, there are a few models that the review pointed to as having, like, stronger research backing.
Yeah.
And one that they highlighted was Entwistle and Vermont's model.
Okay, what makes that one different?
They're really focused on how students approach learning, especially in higher ed. So it's less about, your sensory preferences and more about, like, deeper level strategies.
Right.
So, like, are you somebody who is driven to, like, understand the material really deeply?
Okay.
Or are you more focused on, like, just getting the grade?
So instead of, like, visual learner, maybe we should be asking, like, am I a deep learner or am I a surface learner?
Right. It's not quite that simple, but you're getting the idea.
Right.
And their model is actually used in course design.
Oh, wow.
Although even in Whistle and Vermont acknowledge that it's complex.
Right.
And it has limitations.
Okay, so we've seen now this world of learning styles. It's a lot more complicated and maybe a lot messier than these online quizzes would have us believe.
Yes, definitely.
But where does that leave us? Like, if the science is so shaky, why should we even care about this whole thing?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're going to dig into next.
Okay.
Because even if these, like, rigid categories aren't really the answer, the process of actually thinking about how you learn can still be really valuable.
Okay. I'm ready to keep going.
All right, let's do it.
So we've seen all these limitations with, like, trying to put ourselves into these boxes of learning styles. Yeah. But you said there's still value in thinking about how we learn?
Right.
I'm interested. Tell me more.
I think it's about shifting the focus from, like, labels to strategies.
Okay.
So, like, even if the specific categories like visual learner or kinesthetic learner aren't scientifically sound,
right,
the process of reflecting on your own learning experiences can be really powerful.
Okay.
And that's all about metacognition.
What is metacognition for those of us who aren't familiar with that word?
It's basically thinking about things. So it's that awareness of how your own mind works.
Okay.
What helps you learn what gets in the way.
Okay.
And when you develop strong metacognitive skills, you become more in tune with your learning process.
So instead of being like, oh, I'm a visual learner, it's more like, hey, I seem to remember things better when I see them written down.
Exactly.
Or like I get distracted really easily when I try to study in a noisy environment.
Right.
Okay.
It's about observing your own learning patterns, identifying your strengths and weaknesses, and then using that knowledge to adjust your approach.
I like that. It's like becoming a detective of your own learning process.
Yeah, exactly.
But this research review that we're talking about, that wasn't just like critical of these specific models, right?
Right.
It also raised some like broader concerns about the whole field of learning styles research.
Right.
What are some of those?
Well, one major criticism is that a lot of the studies in this field just aren't very rigorous.
Okay.
So the methodologies are often flawed, the samples are small, and the results haven't been consistently replicated.
So it's not just about questioning the specific models, it's about questioning the whole foundation that they're built upon.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that lack of solid evidence has led some researchers to call for like a complete abandonment of the whole learning styles concept.
Whoa.
There's like, it's just not a scientifically valid framework for understanding learning.
So are they saying that we should just like ignore our individual learning preferences altogether?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I think it's more about acknowledging that those preferences might be more fluid and contextual than we realize.
Okay.
And it's about focusing on developing like a flexible range of learning strategies rather than trying to fit ourselves into these rigid categories.
So instead of trying to force myself to be a visual learner all the time, it's more about recognizing that, okay, sometimes I might learn better visually, sometimes auditorily, sometimes kinesthetically,
Right.
depending on the task or the subject.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that adaptability is really key.
Right.
Because in the real world, you're not always going to be in control of the learning environment or the teaching style.
Right. You've got to go to a lecture sometimes. You've got to read a textbook.
Right, exactly.
You've got to do hands-on stuff.
Sometimes you're going to have a teacher who's really dynamic and engaging.
Right.
Sometimes you're going to have one who's, just reading from a PowerPoint.
Okay. So you need to be able to adapt.
Exactly. And the more you understand your own learning process, the better equipped you'll be to adapt effectively.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You can start to anticipate potential challenges and proactively seek out strategies to overcome them.
So I'm starting to see some of the like practical implications of this.
Yeah.
But the research review also touched on something else, right?
Yeah.
Like there was a political dimension to this whole learning styles debate.
Yes, that's a really important point. And I think one of the things that the authors argue is that the learning styles concept often gets co-opted for political agendas.
How so?
Well, think about it. The idea of tailoring education to individual learning styles sounds great on the surface.
Yeah, it sounds amazing.
Right. It seems like it would make learning, more effective,
Right.
more equitable.
So what's the problem?
The problem is that it often gets presented as like a quick fix solution without addressing the deeper systemic issues in education. So instead of tackling things like inadequate funding, lack of resources, teacher training,
Right.
we get caught up in this idea of like matching every student to their perfect learning style.
Oh, so it's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, it might make you feel a little bit better temporarily, but it's not actually addressing the real problem.
Exactly. And I think what the authors point out is that this focus on learning styles can actually distract from those more substantial issues. It creates this kind of illusion of personalized learning without actually addressing the root causes of educational inequality.
This is getting really thought-provoking.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the science of learning, it's also about the politics of education.
It's all interconnected.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so important to be like critical consumers of this kind of information. We need to ask the tough questions like, what's the evidence? Who benefits from this idea?
Right.
What are the potential downsides?
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks here.
Okay.
If we set aside the questionable science,
Right.
the political agendas, what's the real takeaway for our listeners? Like, what can they actually do with this information?
That's what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
Because even if the labels are flawed, the process of developing this metacognitive awareness,
Right.
of becoming a more mindful learner, is incredibly valuable.
Okay.
It can really empower you to take control of your own learning journey and achieve your full potential.
All right, you've convinced me. Learning styles may be more complicated than, they appear at first, but becoming a more aware learner,
Right.
that's where the power is. So how do we do that? How do we get these like metacognitive superpowers that you're talking about?
Well, I think it starts with just simple observation.
Good.
So the next time you're learning something new, pay attention to what's happening in your mind. What strategies are you using? Are they working?
Our own learning process.
Exactly.
Right.
Like, notice what conditions help you focus.
Yeah.
What kind of information do you grasp easily?
Mm-hmm.
What tends to trip you up? Do you need absolute quiet? Or does a little bit of background noise actually help you concentrate?
Mm-hmm.
Do you learn best by reading, by listening, by doing?
Okay, so I can see how just paying attention to those things can make a big difference.
Yeah.
But what if I realize I'm doing something that's not working? How do I actually change my approach?
Well, that's where experimentation comes in.
Okay.
So once you've identified, some patterns in your learning,
Yeah.
you can start trying out different strategies. And it might feel a little awkward at first, but think of it as like expanding your learning toolkit.
Okay, so give me some examples. What are some strategies I can try?
Well, one technique that's been shown to be really effective is active recall.
Okay.
So instead of just passively reading or listening to something,
Mm-hmm.
you actively try to retrieve the information from your memory.
Okay.
So you could do this by quizzing yourself,
Mm-hmm.
summarizing the material in your own words,
Okay.
or even like teaching it to somebody else.
Teaching to someone else. That sounds terrifying.
It does.
I can see how that would really force you to understand it, though.
It definitely could get you out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
But the research suggests it's one of the most powerful ways to learn.
Okay. What are some other strategies I can add to my toolkit?
Spaced repetition is another really great one.
Okay.
The idea is that you revisit information at increasing intervals,
Uh-huh.
and that helps to solidify it in your long-term memory. There are apps that can help you do this, or you can kind of create your own system.
So instead of like cramming right before a test,
Right.
it's like spacing it out.
Space it out.
Yeah.
Give your brain a chance to actually absorb the information.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
And there are so many other techniques you can explore,
Okay.
like mind mapping,
Mm-hmm.
creating flashcards,
Right.
finding real-world examples that connect the material to.
Yeah.
The key is to find what works best for you
Right.
and for that specific type of learning you're doing.
This is so empowering.
Yeah,
It makes learning feel so much more proactive.
right.
But what about those of us who feel like we're stuck in a rut? Like we're doing things the way we've always done them.
Yeah,
Is it ever too late to change?
it's never too late.
Okay, good.
The brain is incredibly adaptable.
Yeah.
I think the first step is just being willing to try something new.
Okay.
Even if a particular strategy doesn't work perfectly,
Mhm.
you've still learned something about your own learning process.
That's true. You've learned what doesn't work,
Exactly.
which is just as valuable, I guess, as knowing what does work.
Right.
But, let's be realistic. Sometimes we're not going to be in control of the learning environment
Yeah, that's true.
or the teaching methods. So what do we do then?
Well, that's where self-advocacy comes in.
Okay.
So if you're struggling in a particular class or with a particular learning task, don't be afraid to speak up.
Okay.
Talk to your teacher, your professor,
Yeah.
even a classmate.
Mm-hmm.
Explain what's not working for you and ask for suggestions.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's about taking ownership of your learning,
Right.
not just being passive.
Exactly. And remember, everybody learns differently.
Mm-hmm.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Right.
So the key is to find what works best for you and to be open to adjusting your approach as needed.
This has been so eye-opening. I
I
feel like
can-
I'm looking at learning in a whole new way.
I think that's what's so exciting about metacognition.
Yeah.
It really opens up these possibilities.
So before we wrap up,
Yes.
any final words of wisdom for our listeners as they go on their own learning adventures?
Here's what I'll leave you with. Cultivate your curiosity.
Okay.
Be open to new ideas, new perspectives, new ways of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Embrace the challenge and the joy of discovering how your own mind works.
Beautiful. So it's not about the label. It's about the mindset,
I think so.
curiosity, flexibility,
Yeah,
willingness to experiment.
that's it.
Those are the real keys to unlocking your learning.
Exactly. And, if you're interested in diving deeper into like specific learning strategies or
Right.
exploring those models that did have like strong research backing,
Right.
we've got a ton of resources linked in the show notes.
Awesome. Well, there you have it, folks. Learning styles may be more myth than science, but the journey of understanding how you learn best,
Right.
that's an adventure worth taking.
Definitely.
Keep that curiosity alive, and you'll be amazed at what you can achieve.